Well, for the fourth project in Watercolor Workshop, we're doing a space scene. I'm going to show you how to do 4 different space scenes with 4 different watercolor media. We're going to start out with watercolor ink. Now, I'm using Bria Reese watercolor ink, which apparently is no longer in production. So you'll need to search out some other kind of watercolor ink, but uh, there are other brands out there. So the main thing with these is they're very, very transparent. The colors are really vivid. And as you'll see as we go through this part of the project, they really give you a nice blending effect between the colors as you use a hair dryer. I'm going to put my stars on with Higgins waterproof white ink. And so let's start working. We're going to go ahead and speed the video up because I'm going to be doing 4 of these and I don't want the video to be an hour long. So as usual, I'm wetting my paper and the rule is the same as usual. Get it glistening but not dripping. In fact, I'm going to go around and mop up the extra water. And one thing that will show up again and again in this video is because the way I put the watercolors on, like right here, I am using a very dark violet right now. And I'm adding in another color called Lake Blue. But as I add these in, I'm just dripping extra, literally extra water onto the paper. So there's going to be a lot of excess, you'll see, that I'll have to mop up as we go. Now I'm putting on just some red, and then I'm going to add some yellow in. And my rule is with watercolor, or really just about anything, is you try to avoid letting the blue and the yellow touch each other, at least in skies. But for something like this, I really want the blue and the yellow to mix together and give me a really nice rich green. I use almost no green watercolor in these particular paintings. I let the blues and the yellows create those greens, and it's a lot of fun. What I'm doing now is just adding in enough color to try to get rid of any little white areas. And now you can see I've got excess water, and I'm trying to use the brush to sop that up, but there's just so much that the brush just can't help take it off. So in a minute, I'm going to just shift to using my trusty baby wipes. And then when I start using a hair dryer to blend the chalk, blend the watercolor, then you'll see again, there's going to be even more puddling around the edges with some of these paintings. So just be prepared with a paper towel or again, baby wipe. You can use a cloth if you have something you don't mind getting stained. Okay, so what I've done here is this is very random, it's very abstract, and I'm not really trying for any particular kind of design. I just like to put the colors on and let them do what they're going to do. And I've got some really nice greens in the middle, I've got some yellows. And then as I take my hair dryer and begin to blow it, you'll notice that the edges between the colors soften really nicely. And this is an effect that seems to be unique to this watercolor ink. It just softens and blends really nicely, gives you a nice diffusion between the different colors. So I work with that until it's dry, and I want to make sure that the paper is completely dry, because if I put my white on there to make some stars, then if that paper is wet, then the white is going to dilute into the paper, and I really don't want that. So be sure that you've got it nice and dry, and I have just about got it there. Periodically, I'll touch the paper just to, feel, and you can also tell that the paper will flatten out more as it dries. So those are just some cues to look for uh, as you're drying it out and getting it ready for the next step, which is to add some stars in. Now, this isn't a realistic uh, attempt at a realistic space scene. I just want to give it the feel of space, so I'm going to use the waterproof white. And right now I'm using a stencil brush just to, I'm trying several different brushes here in this first one just to see what different effects I get. And you'll notice that the pattern is really small. It's almost impossible to see. So I'm not crazy about using the stencil brush, but if you're looking for smaller results, then maybe that's a good way to go. I use, this is an oil brush now, and I actually got a little bit too much on there. So what I'm doing is I'm just tapping it in, and I'm going to kind of make that into I don't know if you would call it a galaxy, or maybe just another nebula, maybe some space dust, but it's going to be a darkened area in there. And once it dries, it actually looks pretty good. Okay, I'm going to try a couple more options. My go-to tends to be a toothbrush, but you got to be careful because it is difficult to control. And if your angle isn't good, your stars are not going to look like rounded spheres. They're going to be at a bit of an angle. So be sure that when you do that, you're careful to keep the brush angled more vertically as you're running your finger across it. Okay, so this is what the finished product looks like now that it's dry. And I'm going to put it against that black background to just give you a feel for how bright those colors are. The watercolor inks really were the brightest. Okay, let's move on to acrylic ink. Acrylic ink is it's fun to work with, but it's more challenging. One, it's thicker, and I'm just going to be showing you some of the things that I'm using. My trusty baby wipes, my big brushes, getting the paper wet again. The acrylic ink tends to be thicker, and as it dries, it gets a little gloppier. So you've got to work very quickly with it. It's also not as transparent as what we just used, but it still has some really pretty cool effects when you once you have it on the paper. Now, I'm also using black India ink here. This is not waterproof. And the reason I wanted to do that is I didn't have a very good range of colors, and I like to have a really dark value. So the effect that happened when I added the acrylic blue in there was really kind of unique. It affected the black and kind of drove it out, and sort of changed the whole chemistry of that picture. Okay, I'm coming in with some permanent red violet here, and I've got some bubbles you'll see, and I actually use those to my advantage here in a bit. My dropper is no good on my primary yellow. So, but you'll see as you look at these, you can see these are a lot thicker. They're not as transparent as the other colors, and yet they have a nice effect as you begin to tilt the paper and blend them together. And you'll see in a minute when I start with the hair dryer how it affects them as well. I'm adding a little extra water in here just to try to facilitate some blending, and it works really well. As you'll see, we're going to get that yellow moving in to the red and the blue, and again, it's going to be creating some greens. It's also getting into the black, and so I'm going to just tilt it around, move it around, and then here in a second, I'm going to get the hair dryer out, and I'm going to use the air to move that around. And again, I'm going to need to sop up quite a bit of the excess uh, acrylic ink because I've got quite a bit on there. And especially if you're working at home, depending on where you're working, you don't want to get this on surfaces that you don't want to change the color of, because this stuff is not fun to try to get out. Okay, you can see how that's just puddling up there. Just going to wipe that up as I use the hair dryer. It's very thick already, and yet that's part of what gives it a really cool look. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to continue on. Just sop up a little bit more. I've got so much there, way too much. Okay, now it's already starting to dry, but that's giving me actually a chance to move the paint in just a little different way, kind of give me almost another nebula feel there. So I'm going to just blow that around, and it's pretty well dry. Uh, okay, and once it is dry, it's time to add in the stars. I'm going to be using again the same white that I used for the acrylic, or for the watercolor ink. And once I have a few dropperfuls out there, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the brush tapping, but this time I'm using a slightly different brush. I'm using a watercolor brush this time. Gives me a little bit more control than that oil brush. The oil brush wanted to let go of the paint a little too quickly. So there are some stars. And excuse me. I believe, there we go. I knew I was going to put some smaller ones in here. And I do that again with the toothbrush. Overall, the toothbrush is the tool that I really like for doing stars. I think it's the most versatile, but the downside is, again, as I mentioned, if your angle isn't right, the stars don't look right. And the other thing is it tends towards smaller drops. So if I want bigger stars, then I'm going to use a watercolor brush or an oil brush. Okay, let's take that one off. It's dry now. Let's have a look at it on a black background. And there we go. Okay, now we're going to use liquid watercolor. This is Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus Fine Art Watercolor. And I've got several colors I'm going to be working with. You'll notice I'm kind of trying to stay with basic primary colors, although I do add violet in on this one. And I have on the other ones too. But for the most part, I'm just sticking with primaries, red, yellow, and blue, and letting the colors create their own variety. Okay, so we got the paper wet. And convenient thing about these is they come again with droppers. So I'm just going to drop on. I'm using the violet right now. And it was a very interesting effect as I put these on. You can see how it almost blossoms out, almost like flowers. And that's the only one of the water media that I used today that did that. So I'm adding in some red, and it appears that only the violet is the one color that had that effect. Adding in a little red and some yellow, and now I'm going to tilt and let those blend. And this is where I use the bubbles to my own advantage. The bubbles are kind of helping spread the paint, and I'm going to pop them here in just a minute just by using the tip of a brush and just touching enough of the bubble to pop it. I want to add a little bit of blue in here and a little bit of yellow because I want a little more green in this. If you look in the upper right, there's a really nice green transition there between the yellow and the blue. Okay, so I'm going to sop up a little bit more because I'm getting ready for my hair dryer. And I will, when I start blowing that paint around and moving the paint around with the hair dryer, I want to get as much off in advance as possible. Okay, so this is still nice and wet, so it's going to blend nicely. Again, that's one of the disadvantages of the acrylic ink, is it does dry a little fast. And but here I've moved the paper around, not the paper, but I've moved the paint around a little bit, and got it dry now. So the next step, of course, is putting in the stars. And Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus comes with white, so I'm going to use that white. And this is watercolor white, but it still shows up very nicely. It doesn't blend into the background. That's one thing you have to be careful with. But most watercolor whites tend to be opaque, so they do well. And I'm just going with the toothbrush on this one. And again, just holding it down, trying to angle it well, and using my finger to uh, just brush across the toothbrush to get my stars. Okay, it's dry now. And let's see what it looks like. There we go. All right, number 4, tube or pan watercolor. Now I'm using tube watercolor here, but it was dry, and so this is very much like how you would work with pan watercolor. Okay, I've got my flat brush. I've got a large round brush that I'm going to use to apply the paint, and I'm going to use Dr. P.H. Martin's white for my stars in this because I don't have any tube white. So again, we wet the paper. And do that very quickly. Make sure the paper is glistening, not puddling. And once I've got it to where I want it, then I'm going to remove that extra water from the tape. And now I'm going to start out again, as I have with all of these, with a very nice rich blue. If you're using pan watercolors, including the low cost kind that you get at Walmart or Target or whatever, the $1.99, here the main thing is to get the water in the pan and don't dilute the paint too much. Make sure that the paint is nice and strong, and you're going to do as well as you would with the expensive watercolor. The colors may not be quite as vibrant, but they're going to still be pretty close. Okay, so I'm adding some red in here. Added a little kind of a burgundy color. And I'm going to put some yellow in. This yellow is a little bit more opaque, so it's sitting on top. Come in with this. This is actually, it looks orange. It's another variety of red. Okay, so now these are already blending really nicely. And I'm going to tilt them a little bit. And then I'm going to sop some of that extra water off. And let's get the hair dryer out. Sop up a little bit more. And then just let those colors blend. You don't have to use a hair dryer. It's just one extra tool. But when it dries out, that's what you have. Now, I'm going to use, as I said, Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus for my stars. And I've got a little different toothbrush this time, just to see if I get a different result. And this time I'm using my thumb. Always experiment with different things just to see what it will do and how it will look, and don't be afraid to try different things. Okay, and that's what this looks like dry. Let's take the tape off and then put it on the paper again. And then we're going to put all four paintings side by side. So that's with pan watercolors, regular pan watercolors. So here they are. All four of them all look really good, but each one has its own unique characteristics, and each media gives a little different feel in terms of transparency, of how they blend. So I hope you had fun with this, and we'll be back with another one next week.